Good afternoon, everyone. I think we will go ahead and get started. My name is Christine Nardi. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Nonprofit Excellence. We are based in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I am joined today by the Dan River Nonprofit Network in Danville, Volunteer Hampton Roads, the Network Peninsula in Newport News, and the Council of Community Services in Roanoke, in welcoming Senators Warner and Kaine and the close to 400 participants that we expect to attend today's virtual nonprofit town hall. Before we dive in, let me highlight for everyone the agenda for today. We'll start with opening remarks from the senators. After that, there will be 3 live questions from nonprofits across the state. Next, we'll share questions that were submitted by many of you as participants at registration. If you'd like to ask a question during this town hall, you can do so at any time via the live chat function. We'll do our best to take a few questions from the chat box at the end of the Q&A before we give the senators the opportunity to provide closing statements and we end the session. For any themes or questions that don't get addressed today, we'll follow up with the senator's staff for a response. Senators, we had over 80 questions submitted at registration. I think it's fair to say that there's great interest from nonprofits and funders alike in how the federal government is supporting nonprofits and the local communities they serve, not just to recover from our COVID-19 public health crisis and economic shutdown, but also to achieve more just and equitable communities. So we thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. We welcome your opening remarks, starting with Senator Kaine.
Well, thank you, Christine, and thanks to everybody who is on this call. There's a lot to talk about. I know Senator Warner and I are here in Washington in the 4th week of a 5-week work period, and then we'll have a July work period as well. And the goal will be to come up with another coronavirus legislative response. We've done 4 bills, trillions of dollars to try to provide aid for individuals and families, small businesses, large businesses, hospital and healthcare providers, and state and local governments. But we need to do more because the magnitude of the health challenge and the economic challenge is so significant. So one of the things I'm looking forward to about this call is we want to answer your questions, but because we're trying to work with what should be in the next package, I'm also hoping that we'll get good advice from you about topics we should take up. At the same time as we're looking at this unprecedented health challenge, which, I mean, I will bluntly say the US has very poorly performed in dealing with it. Johns Hopkins last year ranked nations in the world and said the United States was among the best prepared nations in the world to deal with the pandemic. And I think that was true. But an administration that downplayed this pandemic, said it wouldn't happen, didn't aggressively start testing. That's why we're now at 120,000 deaths, leading the world in deaths. And that's unfortunate, very unfortunate. What's also unfortunate is the death toll and the toll of this pandemic has had an economic ripple effect. And in both the health and economic effects, you've seen dramatic inequities based on race. Who's disproportionately getting coronavirus? African Americans and Latinos. Who's disproportionately dying of coronavirus? African Americans and Latinos. Who in the quadrupling of the unemployment rate is disproportionately losing their jobs? Minorities, women, young people, almost all at the lower end of the salary ladder. So we're seeing played out in this pandemic gross disparities between, among and between our minority communities. And then when you add to it the sort of one final last straw of the video evidence of these public murders of George Floyd and the murder of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and a cry that no longer can we tolerate indiscriminate and unjustified killing of African Americans in policing kind of malpractices. We are just in a moment where the inequities that have long been part of our society are laid bare. And so the pressure is on us, those of us in elected office, to do things about it. And we are more likely to act the more people are actively engaged. I spent the morning touring Monument Avenue in Richmond, where I live, and seeing the protests largely peaceful from people who have said, we're tired of being told we need to look up to folks who wanted us held in bondage. We don't want to look up to them anymore. We want a society where that is not viewed as worthy of respect, but instead where we commit to living equally as we promised that we would. So there is a huge challenge that I feel, and I know Mark does too, even after many, many years of public service and trying to advance equity in Virginia and having seen some progress, the amount of progress we've made pales by the amount of progress that we still need to make. And we're hoping that both in coronavirus legislation, but also this week, we're going to start talking on the floor of the Senate about police reforms. We're hoping in these two areas, we can start to show concrete steps. We can't do everything that needs to be done. Lord knows the inequities are in education and healthcare and employment, and there are inequities in the hearts of people. But if we can start to show some meaningful steps in our next coronavirus bill or in police reforms, that can then pave the way for even more progress going forward. But I'm so happy to be with you and my longtime friend and the senior senator, Mark, and we look forward to answering your questions, but I think particularly we look forward to taking your suggestions and recommendations.
Thank you, Senator. It certainly is a heavy lift with the next federal stimulus package. Senator Warner?
Well, thank you, Christine, and thank you for inviting Tim and I into this session, and for all that you and all of your colleagues do. In many ways, the burden, the front line of the burden is on all the organizations who you all represent right now. We're kind of unique, I think, as a nation that relies so much on our nonprofit sector. And boy, oh boy, we're asking you to do tons at this point. I agree with everything Tim just said in terms of the racial inequities. Let me hit two or three quick points to build on what Tim said. One is on a very practical point that we did hear you in earlier calls we had. We knew the original legislation had only taken care of 501c3s, but not 501c6s, some of the membership organizations. And we have a ton of those in Virginia, disproportionately up in Northern Virginia. Tim and I were able to get that included in the last kind of fix on PPP so that enterprise now includes all of the nonprofits. I'm not sure there's going to be another bucket on PPP. I think PPP will look back and will say it helped, and I think the fact that the $600 a week helped and the $1,200 per person helped. I think we're going to have to probably more target our efforts going forward is much less broad-based and more targeted. So we'll be anxious to hear your comments. One of the things, and Tim and I have been working on this as well, is that I really fear third and fourth quarter, after Labor Day. And I think there was a great New York Times story, front page today actually, that said, because we've propped up everything, the poverty rate has not, even though the unemployment rate's gone up dramatically, the poverty rate has not gone up that much because we did this, massive $2.7 trillion of direct appropriations and almost another 3 or 4 trillion of 13.3 Federal Reserve efforts. To give you again some framework, that's about 6 times bigger than everything we did in 2008. So this is massive amounts, and we're barely keeping our head above water. But I am concerned third and fourth quarter, as some of these programs start to wind down, that we could see again, due to the inequities that Tim's talked about, healthcare, economic, and I also think on just the plain access to capital, a complete meltdown in Black and brown communities, particularly minority business communities. So I have probably my top item on the agenda for the next bill is to substantially shore up our Black-owned banks, our community development financial institutions with major direct equity infusions and cleaning up their balance sheet, because these are going to be the frontline organizations, many of them nonprofits, that are going to have to lend into the community to shore up businesses. There's a stunning statistic just on Black businesses of about 2.75 million Black businesses in America. About 2 million of them are sole proprietors, beauty salon, barbershop, a couple of them, many of the others, another 500,000 got less than 15 employees. They didn't get as much PPP as majority firms did. So if we can't direct, we're going to have to find some way to help finance a lot of these entities through more traditional enterprises, and that will be Black-owned banks and CDFIs. So that's one item that Tim and I are both working on, and I actually think we've got some Republican support there as well. Wanted to throw out one other comment, and again, not a political call, but history will look back on this administration's response on both PPE, the equipment, and on the testing. And there'll be case studies written about how bad it was and how it pitted state against state and hospital against hospital. One of the things I'm concerned about is that we don't see this same kind of inefficiency and inequity as we come to vaccinations. Give you again an example of this. Virginia, where roughly 8 to 9% of our population, that's even a little high, is Latino. 45% of the cases, recent cases in Virginia, have been Latino, Hispanic community. And yet, if you look at the vaccination trials that are being done by the drug companies, only 1% of the people in trials are Latino. Only 5% of the people in trials are African American. And again, if you're starting with who you're looking at, kind of testing out whether the vaccination is going to work, and it doesn't reflect who's got the virus, that's something that we need to grapple with. One of the things I hope that we can also do, I've been talking to my staff on this one, Tim, and I imagine you have as well, is that on anything further we do with COVID, and I would almost also do this with a look back, we need to do a disparity study about who has been most affected by the virus, racially, regionally, demographically, because we're going to have, even if we have the virus behind us, the level of economic rebuilding that's going to take place over, I think, unfortunately, multiple years. And I think having that evidence of who has been disproportionately affected with as much detail as possible will help us, as Tim and I try to make the case to our colleagues, that we really need to target this to the folks who've been most hard hit. And that's something, again, we can hear from all of you guys, because I know most of your organizations, are out on the front lines helping all the communities that have been hard hit by COVID. So anxious to get your questions and comments and suggestions. And again, Christine, thank you and all the groups who helped put this together. I've been doing a lot of these. This is one of the top 3 in terms of volumes of respondents of, I think, any of these we've done. So great job.
So that doesn't surprise me, Senator, in terms of the engagement of the nonprofit sector in local communities, but I'm glad to hear that. And I want to pass the moderation over to my colleague at Network Peninsula, Karen Dutrow, who's going to introduce a couple of live questions to allow us to go a little bit deeper on some of these issues.
And I think what we've done, when Senator Kaine and I have done these before, like one of us will answer the first, and then we'll flip back and forth, and then let the next person answer, flip back and forth. So, because sometimes the first guy gets all the good stuff.
No, we're going to do an even playing field here. So thank you both for joining us. We have asked 3 nonprofit leaders from across the state to represent their regions and to ask a question directly. We will alternate. We'll start with Senator Warner and give you, 1 to 2 minutes to respond, and then we will let Senator Kaine follow up with any additional comments. We do want to get through those, because then we're going to follow up with additional questions that were submitted during registration. So our first question is from Stephanie Gorham. Stephanie is the Executive Director of Volunteer Hampton Roads in Norfolk.
There we go. Hello, Senators.
Hey, Stephanie.
Sorry, I need to have a little there. So hello. It seems that some in the Senate are trying to take a wait-and-see approach to the next stimulus. According to news reports, the best case scenario has it that senators will begin talking about relief in late July. I know you are not the problem, but please allow me to share a bit of what nonprofits are facing right now and ask your advice on how to get Congress to share our sense of urgency. Community demand on nonprofit organizations providing basic needs is still very high. And at the same time, nonprofits, like many businesses, face increased costs managing COVID-19. Larger nonprofits and many smaller minority-led nonprofits have yet to receive or access any federal lending relief. Many anticipate more layoffs and outright closing. Charitable giving, other than for crisis relief and social justice advocacy, is way down, and we're looking at the 2019 tax filings in a few weeks. If we're going to see an increased incentive for giving, we really have to see it soon. So senators, my question has two parts. The first part of my question is, do you support a universal deduction to incentivize charitable giving beyond 2020? And if so, what new charitable deduction legislation is most likely to be enacted coming out of this pandemic?
First of all, Stephanie, I think you are unfortunately right. Just, as Tim mentioned, we're going to take up the Justice and Policing Act this week. It may or may not drag into next week. We were then going to do the defense bill. So we won't be on COVID again until July 16, 17, whenever we are back. So we are looking, we're looking, I think we'll act fairly quickly once it comes up. I've had some conversations with Secretary Mnuchin, and not to kind of put all the blame on the majority leader, but I actually think a number of my Republican colleagues were willing to move earlier, and then maybe Leader McConnell was willing to move. Guess I'm not shocked at that, but in terms of the universal deduction, yes, I'm willing to extend that. In terms of other charitable deductions, I'm on the finance committee, so this is in my, Tim's not on that committee. He's got armed services, a very powerful committee. But there's not a lot of debate yet, at least that I've heard, about what the menu of other asks are. So one of the things you might want to, either today or later in the session, make the case on what those deductions ought to look like. Tim?
Thank you.
And Stephanie, I'll just say, I guess I'm going to admit to what I don't know. So the universal deduction is beyond the current deductibility of contributions to charitable contributions?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so I'm not aware of that. I'm a huge supporter of the current deductibility of charitable expenses, but I'm just not aware of what an additional universal deduction would look like.
Okay, I can speak to Christine. Do you want to help out and explain how that piece looks like? Is she still available?
I'm here. So happy to do this in follow-up to both your officers, senators, but I think where we are is that we've got a $300 charitable cap through 2020 for charitable deductions, and the goal is to extend that beyond 2020 and perhaps remove the $300 cap for those deductions.
Oh, I see. So this is for standard folks who don't itemize. Okay, I got you. Yeah, I support it. I support that.
Thank you, Christine.
Right.
Okay, so our second question is from Nicole Eames. Nicole is with God's Storehouse in Danville.
Hi, thanks for being here.
Nicole.
I have lobbied with both of y'all, and y'all have been so successful in the past, so this is fun.
That means you've been successful.
This question is for Senator Warner. A bipartisan group led by Senators Brown of Ohio and Scott of South Carolina introduced a bill on Friday to partially fix the problem that many nonprofits are having with unemployment bills. Thankfully, this isn't something that my organization is experiencing because we're considered essential since we're a food pantry, but a lot of the nonprofits in my area have experienced this. And so essentially this bill would repeal an interpretation by the US Labor Department that reimbursing employers must pay the Commonwealth 100% of the cost of unemployment, benefits paid to their laid off and furloughed employees, and then wait for a reimbursement of half of that amount. So my question is two parts. The first part is whether you would support that bill that already has support by the Finance Chairman Grassley and Ranking Member Wyden, and how can we convince Congress to pay the other half of the cost of unemployment that for people who have been laid off due to COVID-19, because I think a lot of those payments will force many Virginia nonprofits to shut their doors forever, which is not something we want to see happen.
Well, Nicole, first of all, I'm not from, if this is a bill that just came in on Friday, that Sheridan and Tim Scott, I'm not aware of it. Let me take a look at it.
Okay.
If you got Grassley and Wyden already, that's a pretty good sign. So, to me, and Sheridan and Tim Scott kind of represent different ends of the spectrum on the Finance Committee. So I'd say the chances are pretty good. I'm not prepared to commit on the the full 100% until I again have some cost basis. I mean, one of the things on unemployment, there's two things that I think we did that were really important and significant. One was the $600 a week bump up that really have kept a lot of people out of poverty. I think Democrats want to maintain that for some additional period of time. Chances are that's going to be a real hot button, though, in terms of a fight, and I don't know how that's all going to play out. But the other part of it, which is something I really, really, really want to maintain, is this expanded unemployment. Traditional Virginia unemployment only covers, I've gotten a couple of different numbers, but it's somewhere between like 30 and 40% of the Virginia workforce. Most people don't get unemployment because they're sole proprietors, they're gig workers, they're 1099ers, they're independent contractors, part-time. And I really think that expansion of unemployment to cover all workers is really important. But if we're going to do that, we've got to find some way that the workers, the payers, and we don't have to call them all employers, but the payers of those workers will make some contribution, because the whole notion of a permanent unemployment system is, you have the workers pay in, you have the employers pay in, you have the state kind of be the insurer company, and you gotta have some additional paying in to maintain that expanded benefit. So I'm very interested in maintaining that expanded benefit, and I'll look again at that additional 50% match, but I need to get the numbers first.
Yeah. Thank you for being honest. Yeah.
And Nicole, I'll look at the bill too. I was not aware of it. I do know, big picture, I think what you're trying to accomplish is you don't want, the employers to have to, we have a bad experience now because more have been unemployed, so our premiums go up dramatically, we have to pay a lot more. This was an economic crisis driven by a massive public health emergency. And so putting that as a responsibility of the employers to start paying higher and higher premiums or pay more is a real challenge for businesses and nonprofits that are already suffering. So we have to figure out a way to not put that burden too heavily on the shoulders of the nonprofits and the companies who weren't laying people off because they wanted to, they weren't firing them, they wanted to keep them employed, but the pandemic dictated otherwise. So there's a number of ways we can figure that out, but I appreciate you asking that question.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Kenyatta C. Kenyatta is with Transitions Family Violence Services in Hampton.
Hello, hi.
Yeah.
So I'm with Transitions Family Violence Services. We're a local nonprofit organization that serves the community that experiences any type of domestic violence. My question is, what kind of legislation or policies can be implemented for police officers to adopt in order to prevent police brutality in the future?
We're going to start with Senator Kaine.
Kenyatta, thank you. We're going to get to a debate about this week. There are two competing proposals on the floor, a proposal that Senators Booker and Harris introduced, and Senator Warner and I are both co-sponsors of it. And then there's a proposal that Senator Scott introduced with some Republican co-sponsors. So the two parties have different approaches. Now, to my way of thinking, the right way to deal with this is not the way we're about to start. What I think we should do is have the Judiciary Committee take both of those bills, immediately have some hearings and try to find a compromise bill that they would vote out to the floor, and then we would have the floor debate. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to have a vote on the Republican proposal, not the Democratic proposal. And we're not even really, in my view, going to be given the opportunity to have a fair discussion about amendments that Democrats might want to offer. Why do I think that really matters? We need to do police reform. I mean, for God's sake, the events of the last few weeks, on top of everything else, demonstrate the need to do police reform. But in 4 key areas, the Democratic bill is very different than the Republican bill. And I think these are big areas that overwhelmingly the American public would support. Number one, the Democratic bill bans chokeholds. They're prohibited, they're illegal. The Republican bill does not. The Democratic bill bars no-knock warrants. You can't bust into somebody's house with a warrant. The Breonna Taylor murder, she was murdered in her own bed, trying to get a good night's sleep before she went back to the hospital because she's a frontline healthcare worker in a pandemic, and she's shot in her own bed because of the no-knock warrant. We would make that illegal. The Republican bill doesn't. The Democratic bill would ban racial and religious profiling. The Republican bill doesn't. And finally, the Democratic bill would adjust what's called the qualified immunity doctrine. Right now, police officers and police departments are shielded from liability even if their behavior is reckless. All we would do would be adjust it. There would still be some immunity for basic everyday activities, but if a jury finds that you engaged in reckless behavior and injured or killed somebody, you wouldn't be protected for that. You would be accountable for it. And what happens is, if you allow recklessness, you get it. And if you don't shield recklessness, you get a lot less of it. And so those are the 4 provisions that I want to see in a final bill to do a good job. None of them are in the GOP bill right now. I'm not sure we're going to even be allowed a chance to offer those amendments. But the good news is, if the Senate just follows a normal process, let the Judiciary Committee kick it around, debate, propose amendments before we report it out to the floor, we can let the committee work for this on 2 weeks. I mean, this is a big, important topic. We don't have to rush, and we can still get it done before the August recess. So that would be my hope. But if we did those 4 things, there are other things that are important too. If we did those 4 things, it would be significant reform.
Let me just echo literally everything that Senator Kaine just said. The country overwhelmingly wants us to do policing justice reform. And I give Senator Scott credit for putting out some ideas. I mean, this man has experienced racial profiling in the Senate as a Black member of the Senate. But I just feel like the idea that either side would try to jam through a one-size-fits-all or one-team-only bill, it's just not right. And as Senator Kaine said, if you had a Judiciary Committee, the Republicans are still the majority in the Senate. It's not like, unless the Democrats could convince a couple of Republican members in the committee to vote on some of these amendments that I'd agree with Tim on, we wouldn't get the, might not change the bill in the committee, but that would be the normal process. And the founders set up a process that, when it works pretty well. Tim and I last week worked really hard on a bill called the Great American Outdoors Act that really helps restore funding for our national parks, gets rid of half of maintenance, helps fund Land and Water Conservation Fund. Took a long time coming, but went through the regular order. We ought to do the same on this reform of police procedures. And I really, really hope that Senator McConnell will, even if we don't send it back to the Judiciary Committee, at least lets us have a number of amendments, because getting into kind of both sides in their corner isn't going to reform the kind of policing the way I think, again, most Americans want. Mm-hmm. Thanks for your question, Kaine.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. And now I'm going to turn the mic over to Evelyn, who's going to take care of the rest of the questions.
Hi, good afternoon. Can everyone see me? I can't see it on my end.
I can hear, is that Karen?
There we come.
There you go. There you go.
There we go through. Never a Zoom call without some kind of technical issue, right? So thank you guys for both joining today. My name is Evelyn Riley. I serve as the executive director of the Dan River Nonprofit Network, which serves Southside Virginia primarily, as well as Caswell County in North Carolina. And I'm going to be asking questions that were submitted by participants during their registration. I'm going to alternate primarily back and forth, but I do have two that we would like to have both of you respond to. So the first is, Senator Klobuchar has introduced a bill that would help governments, nonprofits, and unemployed people make it through to the other side of the pandemic. The Work Now Act would devote $50 billion to a grant program for nonprofits to staff, back up, and quickly hire recently unemployed people to promote community-based solutions. Is this something that you would both support?
I love that idea. Absolutely. I haven't seen the bill, but I absolutely like the idea of incentives to bring unemployed people quickly back to work.
Yeah, and Evelyn, I haven't seen Amy's bill either. The idea that, I put out a slightly different idea called the Paycheck Surely Act that would have said, let's go ahead and reconnect people back to their former employer and have the government directly pay. We suggested 100% of their salary up to 90 grand a year. That probably would never get through the Republicans, but other countries have done this. I think that's been a good approach because, with 42 million Americans filing for uninsurance, we've got about 28 million of those who've lost their health insurance. And even they can go on if they can go on Medicaid, it just makes it a lot more cumbersome. So reconnecting workers is with this direct payment for the unemployed would be one approach. But I'd take a look at Amy's. I'd also say that because one of the most important things we're gonna have to realize, I don't know what the number is gonna be, but 10 or 15% of these jobs that are lost are not coming back in their old form. And how we rethink what we do on training and whether we utilize the on-ramp of nonprofits. I think these are all things that we're going to have to really explore, because it just, a restaurant that had 100 people before may come back, we only have 70, and it may never get back to 100 again. So we're going to have job losses.
Thank you. So the second question that I would like you both to address is about charitable giving. Given the global pandemic and the swift economic shutdown, will you support including emergency charitable stimulus legislation in the next coronavirus relief package by doubling the mandated annual foundation payout over the next 3 years from 5% to 10%, and to mandate the same 10% payout requirement for donor advised funds, which currently have no payout requirement?
Evelyn, I'll start with that. I mean, I am very familiar with this, the 5% minimum payout. I would be interested. Yes, I do think something. Should it be doubled from 5 to 10? Would be a fair question, but I do think this is a remarkably unique time, and there needs to be an increase. And I would obviously extend that as well. I think we're going to have a really, really hard debate on higher education. A lot of our smaller, think about some of the colleges in, Avery, for example, is going to have a really challenging time. And we have not done nearly as much. Tim's wife is a great college president right now at George Mason. The publics at the end of the day are probably going to get through one way or the other. But I really worry about some of the private higher ed, how they're going to get through. And that idea of doubling the minimum payout from their foundations as well would be something worthy of thought. But I've not really looked at numbers. And boy, you guys have got all really good questions. So much for like the generalized, we should have figured this, Tim. If they're going to have this many nonprofits, they were going to come, fully armed.
We use our time wisely.
I will follow up with Mark. One of the interesting things about these pieces of legislation is they have provided a lot of support for nonprofit organizations. So, for example, the PPP program, as originally designed, didn't include even 501c3s. We are able to get that in. That's support of charitable organizations. a lot of the monies that have gone out for education funding and the Child Development Block Grant, Community Services Block Grant, many of those dollars are CAP organizations, community action programs, have gotten funding through the first packages we've done. So it's sort of, what's the best way to get the dollars? You know, is it to double the payout from foundations, or is it to provide direct, you know, allocations on key issues? I agreed with something Mark said right at the beginning. He says he kind of favors at this point targeted aid. As I'm looking at ways to help individuals and families right now, for example, I'm probably less thinking about like a direct check, but more eviction and mortgage, you know, rental and mortgage assistance. Food aid, there's a growing hunger insecurity challenge. As I talk to the food banks around Virginia, I think we need to do direct aid in food. If we try to help people with housing and with food, a lot of that would end up with nonprofits, nonprofit housing providers, housing development authorities, food banks, other organizations. And so I think if we do more aid to help individuals, the nonprofit community is going to be very, very involved in the additional aid that we do.
Thank you. The next question is more of a social justice topic, and I'm going to direct it to Senator Warner. Do you support the defund police movement? And if so, can federal grant funds earmarked for the police be redirected to nonprofits providing community-based services?
I think using the terminology defund the police is not productive. You know, I think that there ought to be more mental health counselors to be able to come and show up when you have a mental health need, or social worker showing up when you've got a social worker need. I think we ask our law enforcement officers to do a ton of things they're not trained or equipped to do? Absolutely. And do we need to potentially shift some resources to make that happen? Yes. But I just don't find the terminology on defund the police, so I don't support that phrase and that term. But I do think, you know, and I've been trying to, you know, learn more over these last number of weeks. I mean, why, you know, I think 1,024 Americans killed in police hands last year, and 4 or 5 in all of the UK, and 0 in Japan. Now, part of that is because, you know, we got 310 million guns on our streets. But part of it, at least what I've started to learn and pick up, is that to become a law enforcement officer, and, you know, in many of the European countries, it's a 2 to 4 year professional training process where you learn, you know, dispute resolution. You learn some basic mental health de-escalation. Whereas in many kinds in our country, you know, you can become a police officer in 2 to 6 months. So, I am interested in major police reform, but I actually think a piece of this may be, you know, radically transitioning the training required and modeling after nations that seem to do this better than us. And that may, in the end of the day, at least in the short term, require additional, not less resources. But I do think one of the things, again, just one last point before we you know, and Tim has been a real leader on this one, the idea that some of these, you know, some of the military equipment things that are passed on to the police, and that some of that just, I don't know how it actually originally started, but boy, it's about time to end it, because it doesn't ensure the safety or tranquility of a lot of our communities.
Evelyn, I generally agree with Mark on this one, and I think it's important enough to say a word about it. Kenyatta asked the question earlier from the standpoint of a charitable organization that works in the domestic violence space. I had a meeting last week by Zoom with our domestic violence and child welfare agencies across the country and across the Commonwealth. And, you know, that's an awful lot what most police forces do. If you do a ride along ever with police, and I've done one a few times, I was surprised the first time I did it, how much of a police officer's shift is responding to domestic violence calls. And you're basically, it's trying to protect vulnerable women from domestic violence. And that's often the most dangerous call that a police officer will do because the emotions are very high in that situation. So when I hear defund police, I think, well, wait a minute, how are we going to protect people from domestic violence? You know, now, but if it's better uses of funding, you'd have police departments and sheriffs saying, why doesn't society do more for mental health? It's unfair to ask law enforcement to be like frontline mental health providers only because society's too stingy to really do mental health services. Most jails are filled with people who shouldn't even be in jail because they have an untreated mental health or a substance use disorder and there's no services. So we would do a lot better by people and also by law enforcement if we actually invested more in things like mental health services. So that I completely get. And we need to think about how to reorient some of the dollars.
That actually transitions perfectly into the next question, which is about public health. And so Senator Kaine, what can be done by Congress? What do you support to increase access to mental health services, especially for treatment of substance use disorders and addiction to address the rising need during the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a really good question, during the pandemic, because what we've seen in hospitals in Virginia and organizations that work with folks with substance use disorder, we're seeing dramatic upticks in overdoses. Why? Because more stress and some of the traditional safety net, being able to go to a group, you know, NA or AA meeting, being able to go to a therapy session, harder to do when social distancing. So if the stresses are going up and your treatment options are reducing and your safety net's fraying, stands to reason you're going to see more challenges. So I definitely think, and we put, you know, significant funding into the system in the last few years through the CARES Act and some other acts to do better on substance use disorders, to treat them more like a public health problem than just a law enforcement, you know, we got to crack down on you. That's good, but we're still not doing enough. In particular, we don't have enough trained behavioral health professionals in the country. I'm on the Education Committee, Health, Education, Labor, Pension, and we're working on the Higher Education Act now, which tries to incentivize people to go into fields where we clearly don't have enough folks. And as we're working on that bill, we're trying to figure out ways to incentivize the training of more people to be mental health, behavioral health professionals.
Thank you. Senator Warner, addressing the digital divide, as work, nonprofit organizations, K through 12 higher education, and telehealth services move online, the internet is increasingly becoming a lifeline to which all households need access, and yet lack of access to reliable broadband reinforces inequity, especially for rural and low-income communities. That is a solvable problem. What can you as senators and Congress do to work towards solving this?
Evelyn, great question. And this is an area where I think we have fallen short in the COVID legislation so far. And we did send out, I sent out a letter early, at the very beginning of the virus to all the internet service providers to say, you know, during the pandemic, you can't charge people for extra data if they have to be working from home and studying from home. You shouldn't do disconnects if people, you know, don't pay their bills. And, you know, generally speaking, the existing incumbents had done decent on that piece. I also think one of the things we need to do is make sure all of the temporary adjustments we made on reimbursements, for example, on telehealth are maintained. I think that there's a silver lining in this coronavirus. We have, you know, moved forward by 5 to 10 years the use of telehealth, and we've got to make sure that the emergency provisions we put in, especially on things like reimbursements, are maintained. But in terms of actual broadband deployment, we've done crappy. That's a technical term. There was, you know, virtually no money, a few hundreds of millions of dollars in the CARES bill. We should do 3 things around broadband. One, on a short-term basis, we need, for the balance of the crisis, I would say at least through the, you know, through spring of 2021, because we don't know on school year next year how much we may be in and out. We got to increase the power on our existing antennas. We need to decrease what's called the exclusion zone if you're near a federal facility, so they would use, you could get closer to that federal facility, 35 kilometers instead of 75 kilometers, and still get coverage. I think we ought to go ahead and take, you know, you're in Danville, We're going to take all of the, mid-Atlantic broadband where they've wired different places and put temporary antennas on school buildings to provide, again, some coverage. We could, for very little money, in very little time, increase coverage by about 30%. Now we'd have a debate with some folks because the E-rate monies, these are the monies we all pay into a generalized fund. A lot of that money is only used for school buildings. We'd have a debate, even with some of our teacher groups, whether those funds should be used for last mile. We've even got an available source of capital. So I would say there's a short-term regulatory changes. There's middle term, and this is where, in some of these rural communities where for years, the Comcast or Verizons are saying, well, we're going to get to you, and then they never get to you. I would go ahead and open up the ability to, say to the local utility, if you got a rural co-op or something, hey, we've given you incumbent umpteen years, you've not built out, you can go ahead and build out now as a competitor. And in parts of Virginia, we've done this before in Lynchburg and Bristol. That would be radical. I mean, there would be the internet service providers would really push back, but I think it would put a real pressure. And then third, I think it's time to go ahead and pull the trigger and make the kind of commitment that Franklin Roosevelt made to Americans in the mid-30s, that they were going to get you electricity no matter where you ice broadband. That would be an $80 billion to $100 billion investment, but it would put literally hundreds of thousands of Americans to work. And how we do that last mile, whether it's fiber to the home or low Earth orbit satellite or wireless, we can debate that, but we ought to go ahead and make that infrastructure investment that's needed. So there's a little plan, a medium plan, and a big plan. And I honestly think this is an area where Congress has, the CARES bills so far have not done the job. Sorry for going on so long on that one. That one's been, as you know, my background is all in that field. So.
Very comprehensive plan. Senator Kaine, as we know, there's no return to work without quality childcare and early childhood education. How can we restart and better resource early childhood ages 0 to 5 education through public and private partnerships?
Well, first, you're right, public-private partnerships. We need to do our bit at the federal level. The CARES Act in March had billions of dollars for the Child Development Block Grant Fund, but that was, over on the thought that we would be doing this for a couple of months. That was not long-term funding. So I do think funding for childcare needs to be part of the next package, sort of as in the way Mark was saying, targeted more. You need assistance in childcare, you need rent assistance, you need food assistance, we should target it. And then at the state level, this is something that, Virginia is really focusing on at the state level too. And I do think public-private partnerships are important. Some of the best providers of pre-K in Virginia are private providers who have been going for 80 years. I visited a 100-year-old program once when I was governor, and we can use all of the above approach. As long as it's high quality, we should have funding that is available to expand childcare. So federal funding, but I still think the system runs pretty well if the funding is there, if the state is able to manage the system, and I would say that they should continue to do that.
And Evelyn, let me go ahead and give you guys in Danville a big shout out here. People like Ben Davenport and others, your Smart Beginnings initiative, it really is kind of I think the envy of the state, and kudos for you guys, because you got public sector, you got private sector, you got church, it really feels to me like you've done a great job there.
Well, I'll say thank you on their behalf, and if they're not on the call, we'll definitely make sure that they get the copy so they hear the shout out. Thank you. Last question from me before we transition towards closing remarks is to Senator Warner. What do you see as the most promising initiatives to retrain workers unemployed due to the pandemic, and what can Congress do through Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act to, or other legislations to enact these and provide funding to help reskill our workforce?
You guys really did some research again, because you kind of asked each of us based on our expertise areas. So thank you very much for that question, Evelyn, because if I could have two wishes in the next COVID bill. The first one I already talked about, which is I want to get more money into community development financial institutions, minority-owned banks, and stuff to make sure that we've got support network from, low-income communities post-Labor Day. The other, which I'd even want more, is to completely change the tax accounting and reporting system we have in this country on investment in human beings. And poor Tim has had to hear me make this spiel a million times. I'll give it really quickly. We have a tax code now that so favors anybody to invest in a tangible good, a robot or a piece of machinery, rather than a human being. So the example I use is if a company buys a robot for $5,000, the company gets an R&D tax credit on that robot. The robot's viewed as an asset, and you can put it on your balance sheet and you can brag about it. If the same company hires 2 workers to be more effective and trains them to be more effective in the robot, you don't get the same tax advantage. It's viewed as a cost and an expense, not an asset class. It's not something you can report, although the Securities and Exchange Commission has started to ask companies to report their investment in human beings. I think there is a time beyond WIOA and some of these programs to make a radical shift in how we view public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector investment in training. And the delivery mechanism doesn't have to be a private sector. It could be a nonprofit. But we need to incent businesses and others to do, treat, at least equalize investment in people with investment in tangible goods. I got to make that simpler and shorter, but it is a really big idea, at least I believe.
I think that nonprofits are keenly aware of that as well, because it is much easier, might be the word I would choose, to find funding for programs and for things than it is for people right, in the sector. So I think there's a lot of overlap there. We have a couple minutes for you each to have closing statements, and then we'll transition it back over to Christine.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for what you do. Please get us the other suggestions on deductibility issues, charitable deduction issues, I know which apply to all of you. A number of the comments you've made on specific legislation that we didn't have, that I didn't have knowledge of or Tim didn't have knowledge of, please get to our staffs. Our staffs are on this line. And we're going to get through this. I have great faith in Virginia and great faith in America. But boy, what you guys do is more important than ever right now. And so, as one of the 2 representatives of Virginia, on behalf of the 8.5 million of our fellow Virginians, God bless you for what you do and stay strong.
Evelyn and team, thanks. It's really good to do this together with Mark. And, he started off his comments at the beginning by just talking about the importance of the work that you do. And we also know, as we conclude, that it's a challenging time. Everybody on this call, you have your own anxieties about your own health, about health of the people that you love. Maybe somebody who's been sick. You might know somebody who's died. Maybe you haven't been able to visit a parent or grandparent in a nursing home or been able to go visit a child or a grandchild. You have your own economic anxieties and those in your family. And you're all working with people who have these health and fiscal anxieties, as well as people who are really suffering because of this manifest racial injustice that's replaying on our television screens endlessly. So it's emotionally a time of just great stress. And so I just want to begin my closing comments just by expressing my, solidarity or sympathy or condolences to y'all. If you had told me 3 months ago that, my wife and I would both have had coronavirus, 2 of our 3 adult children would be laid off work because their jobs are closed. We know 4 people who passed away. I would have said, you got to be kidding me. That can't be the case. We're fortunate people. We have good salaries. We have good health care. We got a safety net. That couldn't be us. But it's touched us enough to make us realize, well, what if we didn't have a good salary? What if we didn't have health insurance? What if we didn't have the safety net of friends or family, or a house where my wife and I can quarantine at other ends of the house without stepping on each other's toes all the time? So this affects everyone, but it's not affecting everyone equally. And an awful lot of the people who are really on the receiving end of the effects are the folks that you are working with every day. And as Mark said, we thank you for it. This is an important time for you to let us know priorities, things that should be in the next bill. I wish we were doing the next bill sooner. I'm mad that the GOP doesn't have the sense of urgency, but the one little benefit of it is well, we can get more input and get more lay of the land and current information and hopefully make the next bill better. So do reach out to Team Warner and Team Kaine, to our staffs, so that we can hear the kinds of priorities as you shared them today. And I really appreciate the chance just to visit for a bit.
Thank you, Senators. And Senator Kaine, to that point, what would you advise as the most effective way for nonprofits, especially our local grassroots, our neighborhood nonprofits without lobbying shops, to convey their needs to you and to advocate? And do you have specific legislative staffers that work specifically on issues related to nonprofits?
Absolutely. So probably the best point of contact on this call, I have Gwen Mason, who runs my Roanoke office and is also in charge of all grants work for the office. So sometimes even under the CARES Act, there's grants you can apply for. If any of you want to get information about grants, call my Roanoke office and ask for Gwen. But on any other policy issue, probably the right person is Nick Barbash, who's my legislative director, or Corinne Dongo. And Corinne is on this call, who's my state director. So Gwen for grants, for COVID-related policy, either Nick Barbash or Corinne Dongo, and they're in the DC office. And if you call, you can find your way to them.
Thank you,
Christine, let me just add quickly. I got Charity Howell from my Richmond office on, and like Tim said, I think Elizabeth Falcone, my ledge director, because some of these things touch finance, some of these things touch healthcare. She'll be the traffic cop because it won't probably end up with her, but you guys touch every part of people's lives, and we ought to have the incoming. So Charity in Richmond, Elizabeth here in Washington.
Thank you, Senator. And a quick thank you to all of our participants for joining the call today and for your timely and critical questions. We will make the recording available following the call, and those questions that didn't get asked, we'll follow up with the Senator's office for a response. I want to say a note of appreciation for the virtual town hall partnership with our nonprofit capacity building colleagues in Danville and Newport News and Hampton Roads and Roanoke, and extend a special and final thank you to Senators Warner and Kaine for your accessibility during this time of great challenge, the candor of your responses, and your hard work on behalf of our Commonwealth and the country. Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.